My daughter-in-law boxed up my whole life into cardboard while I was at Sunday service. And by the time I came home, she had taken my photo off the wall, painted over my husband's name above the door, and told my own grandchildren that their grandmother was stepping back. What she did not know, what nobody in that family had thought to check in 12 years, was that the building she now believed was hers. The franchise she had announced at dinner was hers. The license the city had stamped. Every one of them carried only one name, and that name was mine. My name is Della Mayfield. I am 67 years old. I buried my husband Otis 4 years ago this past winter. And for 40 years the two of us, and then just me, ran a soul food kitchen on the corner of Pratt and Vine that fed 3 generations of this neighborhood. I am going to tell you what it cost to be treated as dead weight in the place I built with my own 2 hands, and what it was worth on the morning the landlord and the franchise board walked through my door needing a signature that only I could give. But before I take you to that morning, I want to ask you something, because I suspect some of you already feel the shape of this story pressing against your own ribs. Have you ever been quietly written off by the very people you spent your life feeding? If you have, then stay with me. Because this is a story about being made invisible in your own kitchen, and about the day the lights came back up and everyone in the room finally remembered your name. Let me go back, though, because a reckoning is just noise, unless you understand the wound underneath it. Otis and I opened Mayfield's kitchen in the spring of the year I turned 27, in a narrow, rented storefront that had been a laundry, and before that, a shoe repair, and before that, nothing anyone could remember. The landlord at the time, an old man named Sal Pruitt, who has been dead now 30 years, did not want to rent to us. I want to say that plainly and let it sit. He stood in the doorway of that empty storefront with his arms crossed, and he looked at my Otis, a tall, careful, soft-spoken man in his good Sunday suit. And he looked at me, 26 years old with my hair pressed and my gloves on, and he said he was not sure the neighborhood was ready for what we had in mind. He meant something he did not have the courage to say out loud. We knew exactly what he meant. And Otis, who never in his life raised his voice when a quiet one would carry further, took off his hat and he said, "Mr. Pruitt, give us a year. If we are not the best tenant you have ever had by then, we will hand you the keys ourselves." And something in the way he said it, something steady and unafraid, made that old man uncross his arms. We signed the lease that week, and I want you to remember this, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. When we signed it, Otis put my name on it, not because either of us had a plan for what would come 40 years later. He did it because he could not read contracts the way I could. Numbers swam sideways in his head, and I had a head for them, and he trusted me with the part of our life that lived on paper the way I trusted him with the part that lived in the pots. He used to say, "Della keeps the books and I keep the kitchen, and between the two of us there is not a thing in this world we cannot run." So my name went on the lease. Della Mayfield, sole tenant. And it stayed there, renewal after renewal, year after year, for 40 years, because we never once had a reason to change it. That first year was the hardest work of my life, and I have done hard work. We opened with a fryer we bought secondhand, a deep freezer that hummed like a freight train, and $300 that we had saved in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator. Otis cooked. Lord, that man could cook. He had learned at the elbow of his own grandmother down in the low country, and he carried her whole catalog in his hands, her cornbread that was sweet but not too sweet, her oxtails that fell off the bone, her greens cooked slow with smoked turkey instead of pork because half the neighborhood could not eat pork, her peach cobbler that made grown men cry into their napkins. He never wrote any of it down. It lived in his hands and in his head, and in the back of a worn composition book that he guarded like scripture. And I used to tease him that if the building ever burned, he should save the book before he saved me. And he would say, low and serious, I would save you, Della, and then I would build the recipes back from your face, because everything I cook, I learned by trying to make you smile. I kept the books. I want you to hear that, because it is going to matter a great deal before this story is over. I did not just stand at a register and make change. I learned the tax code at our kitchen table by lamplight, with the children sleeping in the next room. I negotiated with the produce men and the meat men, and I learned which of them would cheat a black couple on a Friday delivery, and I stopped buying from them, quietly, without a scene. And I found better men. I read every contract that ever crossed our threshold, line by line, the way some women read scripture, looking for the clause on the 4th page written in language designed to be skipped, the clause that would have let somebody take from us what we had built. I caught those clauses. I struck them out. I initialed the margin, and I sent the papers back. And the men on the other end learned slowly that Mayfield's did not sign what it had not read. If you have made it this far into my story, and you know in your own body the particular ache of being the one who does the unglamorous work, the books, the contracts, the worrying at 2 a.m, the work nobody throws a party for, then I want you to do one small thing for me before I go on. Subscribe to this channel, Her Quiet Reckoning, because everything we tell here is for the women the world looks straight through, the ones who built the whole house and got handed the smallest chair in it, the ones who kept the books while everyone else took the bows. This is the place where the quiet ones finally get the floor. What I am about to tell you is the part I have carried for years without saying out loud. And I would rather say it to people who already understand, in their own bones, why it matters so much. We grew slow, and we grew real. By the 5th year, we had bought the booths, real wood, that I still have to this day. By the 10th year, there was a line out the door on Sundays after church. Deacons in their good suits, and young mothers with babies on their hips, and old men who came alone every single day, and sat at the counter because we were the only family they had left. Otis hung a sign over the door that he painted himself, Mayfield's Kitchen, in warm gold letters on a deep green board, and under it, in smaller letters, he painted the words, "Where you eat like family." He was not a man for slogans, but he believed that one. We did eat like family, all of us, the whole neighborhood, for 40 years. When the franchise people came to us, it was the 1990s, and a regional company that was building a small group of soul food restaurants across 3 states wanted our recipes and our name. I read that contract for 2 weeks. I read it until I knew it better than the men who wrote it. And what I would not give up, what I held the line on through 6 rounds of negotiation while their lawyers got impatient and Otis got nervous, was control. I would license the Mayfield name and Otis's recipes to them, region by region. But the master license, the original, the founder's license, stayed with us. With me, specifically, because I was the one who signed. They could open Mayfield's kitchens from here to 2 states over, and they did, and we earned from every one of them. But the mother license, the one all the others hung from, was mine. Renewable by me, revocable by me, in my name and no one else's. Their lawyers told me, more than once, that this was an unusual structure and that we were leaving money on the table by not selling it to them outright. I told them, more than once, that I was not interested in the table. I was interested in the kitchen, and the kitchen stays ours. I want to tell you about my children, because they are in this story even when they are not standing in the front of it. We had 2. Our daughter Renee, who is a nurse 2 states away, and a steady, good soul, and who I will tell you about later because she matters at the end. And our son, Marcus. Marcus was our youngest, and he grew up in that restaurant the way a fish grows up in water. He bussed tables before he could see over them. He learned to make change at the register standing on a milk crate. He could fold a napkin and carry 3 plates on one arm by the time he was 10. He loved that place, and that place loved him. And for a long time, I believed he would carry it forward when Otis and I could no longer stand at the stove. But Marcus had a softness in him, a wanting to be liked, that I saw early and did not know how to harden, because you cannot give a child a backbone by wishing one into him. He was the kind of boy who would rather agree than be right. The kind who, if 2 people were pulling at him, would tear himself in half before he would disappoint either one. Otis used to worry about it. He would say, "That boy needs to learn that you cannot keep everybody happy, and the sooner life teaches him, the better." Life did teach him. It just took longer than either of us wanted, and Otis did not live to see it. And I had to be the one to do the teaching, in front of a room full of people, on the worst and best morning of my life. Otis died 4 years ago, in the winter, in our bed, with the radiator ticking and the first gray light coming through the curtains. He had been tired in a way that was not like him for a few months, and the doctors took it lightly until they took it too seriously. And then there was a short, hard season. And then there was the morning I woke up beside him. He was already gone quiet, the way he did everything. I held his hand until it went cool, and I did not call anyone for a long time, because I was not ready to share him with the world's machinery of death just yet. And in that hour, in the gray light, I made him a promise. I told him I would keep the kitchen going. I told him the recipes would not die with him. I did not yet know how much that promise would cost me, or who I would have to become to keep it. The restaurant nearly died with him those first months. I could not go in for a while. My sister came and ran the front, and a young cook named Terrence, who Otis had been teaching, held the kitchen together out of the composition book, which Otis had finally, in his last year, let me copy out into a clean hand, every recipe, every measurement, every margin note, into a binder that I kept locked in the office safe along with the lease and the license. That binder, in my handwriting, transcribed from his, became the only place outside Terrence's hands where Otis's whole catalog lived. I want you to remember that too. Everything in this story comes down to whose hand the important things were written in. Marcus came home for the funeral, and he stayed. He had been working a job he hated in an office 2 hours away, in commercial real estate of all things, wearing a tie and selling buildings he did not care about. And when his father died, something in him turned toward home. He told me he wanted to come back and help me run the restaurant, and I wept, because it was the thing Otis and I had hoped for, and because I was so tired and so alone, and the idea of my son beside me at that counter felt like a hand on my back. So Marcus came home, and about a year after that, Marcus brought home Renata. I want to be fair to Renata, because what she did to me was a great wrong, and I could make her a monster in the telling. And she was not a monster. She was something more ordinary and more dangerous than a monster. She was a person who had decided, somewhere very young, that the only safety in this world is control, and that the only respect worth having is the kind you take. Renata was sharp. I will give her that, and I give it to you, because I want you to see her clearly, and not as a cartoon. She had gone to school for business. She had worked in marketing for a chain of fitness studios. And she had a real gift for making a thing look expensive. She walked into Mayfield's kitchen the first time on Marcus's arm in a tan blazer that fit her like it was sewn on her that morning. and she looked around at the wooden booths that I had bought with the first profit we ever made, and the hand-painted sign, and the framed photo of Otis behind the counter, and the old men at the counter. And I watched her face do a small thing that she thought I did not see. She was adding it up. She was looking at 40 years of a family's life and seeing a property with poor margins. She married my son in a hotel ballroom that cost more than our first year of rent. And I was glad for them, truly. Because Marcus looked at her the way Otis used to look at me. And I thought, well, she is hard, but maybe she is hard the way a good knife is hard, useful, and maybe she will be good for him, will give him the backbone he never grew. I had it exactly backwards. She did not give him a backbone. She replaced his. It started the way these things always start, with help. Renata wanted to help. And some of the help was real, and I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to pretend she did nothing right. The restaurant had been running on my 40-year-old systems and Otis's instinct, and the books, which I still kept, were sound but old-fashioned. Renata came in and put us on a computer. She built us a presence on the telephone screens that I do not fully understand to this day. The places where young people find a restaurant now. And within a few months, there were faces in our booths I had never seen. Young people who had read about us somewhere on those screens, and they ordered the oxtails and they took photographs of the cornbread before they ate it, which I found strange and a little wonderful. Business went up. I will not pretend it did not. Renata was good at making the old thing findable by new people, and for a season I was grateful, and I told her so. But there is a difference between helping a thing grow and deciding you own it. And that difference is a line that Renata crossed so gradually that I could not tell you the exact day. First, she was helping with the books. Then she was keeping the books. And I let her, because my eyes were not what they were and I was tired, and it felt like a kindness that my son's wife wanted to carry that weight. Then she was making decisions about the menu, small ones, a new appetizer, a fancier word for the greens on the printed card. Then she was making decisions about the staff. She let Terence go. Terence, who Otis had taught, who held the kitchen together the winter my husband died, who had the recipes in his hands. She told me he was a redundancy. That was her word. Redundant, a man. And replaced him with a younger cook who would work cheaper and who had to learn Otis's catalog out of my binder. I should have stopped it there. I have asked myself 1,000 times why I did not. The truest answer is that I was lonely, and I did not want to be the difficult mother-in-law. The old woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed the way Sal Pruitt had stood in our doorway 40 years before. And so I told myself that this was what stepping back gracefully looked like. And I stepped, and I stepped. And I did not understand that with every step I took back, she took 2 forward. Until one day I looked up, and I was standing in a corner of my own restaurant with nowhere left to step. There came a season they called modernizing. Renata sat me down at a table, with Marcus beside her not quite meeting my eyes, and she laid out a plan. The restaurant needed to grow, she said. The brand, that was her word, brand. The brand needed to be refreshed if we were going to take it to the next level. There were investors interested, she said. There was a whole future, she said, if I would just let them run with it. And she said the thing that she had clearly rehearsed, the thing that was meant to sound like respect and was actually a request for the keys. She said, Della, you built something beautiful. Let us carry it now. You have earned your rest. You have earned your rest. I have learned that when somebody tells you that you have earned your rest, you should count the silver. I said yes. I want you to understand why. Because it is the wound at the center of all of this. I said yes because I loved my son and because I wanted, more than I wanted to be right, to keep the two of them in my life. And because I believed, God forgive my foolishness, that letting them feel ownership would bind us closer, not break us apart. So I let Renata modernize. I let her change the menu cards and the lighting and the way the staff dressed. I let her and Marcus and the quiet investors I never met run the day-to-day of the restaurant Otis and I had built. I came in 3 days a week and worked the counter and talked to the old men and made the cobbler myself on Sundays because the new cook never could get it right. And I told myself this was a fine way for an old woman to spend the end of a long life of work. But here is the thing I did. The thing that this whole story turns on. And I did it not out of suspicion, but out of 40 years of habit. The habit of the woman who reads the contract on the 4th page. When Renata's lawyer drew up the papers to make Marcus a partner in the operating company, the company that ran the day-to-day, I signed them because Marcus was my son and it was right that he should have a stake in the thing he worked. But the operating company was not the restaurant. The operating company rented the building from me. The operating company licensed the Mayfield name and recipes from me. The lease on the building at Pratt & Vine stayed in my name, Della Mayfield, sole tenant, because no one ever thought to ask me to change it. And I, out of habit, did not volunteer to. The master franchise license, the founder's license that every other Mayfield's kitchen in 3 states hung from, stayed in my name, sole holder, because that is how I had structured it in the 1990s, and no one in this new modern arrangement understood the structure well enough to know it needed changing. The city health license, the permit that legally allowed any food to be served on those premises at all, was issued to me, Della Mayfield, owner of record. Because 40 years ago, I was the one who filled out the form, and I had simply renewed it in my own name every 2 years since. The way you renew a thing you have always renewed, without thinking about it. So Renata modernized the brand. She refreshed the menu. She made my son a partner in the company that ran the restaurant. And not one of them, not the lawyer, not the investors, not Renata with all her sharpness, ever looked underneath the operating company to the bedrock it stood on. And so not one of them noticed that the building, the brand, and the legal right to serve a single plate of food in that place all rested, still, entirely and only, on the name of the old woman they had just told had earned her rest. I noticed. I noticed because noticing is the work I have done my whole life. But I said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. And because a part of me, the part that keeps the books, the part that had read 10,000 contracts looking for the buried clause, filed it away quietly, the way you note a thing that may matter someday, and went back to making the cobbler. The Sunday it happened was an ordinary Sunday, which is how the hardest days usually arrive, dressed as ordinary ones. I went to church the way I have gone to church every Sunday of my life. I put on my good navy blazer and my emerald blouse, the one Otis always said brought the green out in the cooking smell that never quite left my skin, and my pearl earrings, and my mother's fine gold chain, and the wedding band I have not taken off in 45 years. I sat in the 4th pew on the left, where I always sit, between Sister Lorna and the Whitfield twins, and I sang, and I bowed my head, and I prayed for my children the way a mother does, which is to say I prayed for Marcus to find his backbone, and I prayed for Renata to find her peace. Because a woman that hungry for control is a woman who has never once felt safe. And I have learned to pity hunger even when it bites me. I was at that service for 3 hours. We had a guest preacher, and the choir was full and the spirit was high, and I came out into the bright afternoon feeling washed and quiet and ready for the chicken I had left warming. And I drove to the restaurant, because Sunday afternoons I always went by the restaurant to make the cobbler for the evening, My one job that no one had taken from me. The last thing in that place that was still mine to do with my own hands. I knew something was wrong before I reached the door, because the sign was wrong. The hand-painted sign that Otis made, Mayfield's Kitchen in gold on green, where you eat like family, was gone. In its place, still wet at the edges, was a flat white board with a single sleek black word on it. Modern, lowercase. The way young people make everything lowercase now. And underneath it, in tiny gray letters, a phrase about elevated comfort cuisine. I stood on the sidewalk in my church clothes, and I looked up at the place where my husband's hand had been for 40 years, painted over, and I felt the afternoon go very quiet and very far away. I went inside. The booths were still there, the wooden booths, but they had been pushed around into a new arrangement, and half of them were draped in plastic. The walls had been stripped, and the wall behind the counter, the wall where the framed photograph of Otis had hung for 4 years since his death, the photograph of him in his apron smiling behind this very counter, that wall was bare, with a clean pale rectangle where the frame had kept the paint from fading, a ghost of my husband in the shape of his absence. I stood in the middle of my own restaurant in my Sunday clothes, and I turned in a slow circle. And I will tell you that I did not cry, not then, because shock does not let you cry. It just holds you very still while it sinks in. And then Renata came out of the back, and she was carrying a cardboard box, and she stopped when she saw me. And for just 1/2 of 1 second, before she arranged her face, I saw the thing underneath, which was not guilt. It was annoyance. The annoyance of someone interrupted in the middle of a job. She set the box down on the counter, and she smiled the smile she used on the investors, and she said, "Della, I thought you had church until later." And I looked at the box, and on the side of it, in her neat marker hand, was written one word: Della, my name on a box. And I understood that the box was me. The box was my apron and my recipe cards, and the small things from the office that were mine, my reading glasses, the photograph of Otis, the little brass clock my daughter gave me, all of it, boxed and labeled with my own name, like something being put into storage. I said very quietly, "Renata, what is this?" And she said the thing she had clearly rehearsed, because it came out smooth, with no edges, the way only a prepared cruelty does. She said, "We are doing a refresh, Della, a full one. The investors want the space cleared so the designers can come in this week. I had the team box up your personal things so nothing would get damaged. They are going in the garage at the house, safe and sound, until we figure out where everything lands." And then she said, looking at the bare wall where Otis had been, in a voice meant to sound gentle, "We thought a cleaner aesthetic going forward. Fewer of the old photos. It reads more current. Fewer of the old photos. My husband, the man who built this place with his hands, the man whose recipes were the only reason a single one of those young people had ever heard the name Mayfield, was one of the old photos. He read less current. I want to tell you that I said something fierce. I did not. I have learned that the deepest cuts do not bleed right away. I stood there, and I asked, in a voice that I kept very level because it was the only thing I had left to control, where the photograph of my husband was. And she went to the box with my name on it. And she lifted out the frame, and she handed it to me, almost kindly, the way you hand a child a toy to quiet it. And she said, "Of course you can keep that one at home." And I held my husband's photograph against my chest in the middle of the restaurant we built. And I understood that I had been boxed up and set in a garage along with everything else from the past that read less current. And then the children came in. My grandchildren. Marcus and Renata's too. a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, my heart and my heart, came in from the car where they had been waiting. And they ran to me the way they always do. And I knelt down with my husband's photograph still in my arm, and I held them. And the little one, the girl, looked up at me with her face all worry. And she said, "Grandma." Mommy said, "You're not going to be at the restaurant anymore." She said, "You're stepping back." Are you sick like Grandpa was? Are you sick like Grandpa was? That is what my daughter-in-law had told my grandchildren. Not that I was busy. Not that I was resting. She had told 2 small children, in whatever words she chose, that their grandmother was stepping back. And a 6-year-old does not have a category for an old person stepping back that is not the category of the last old person who left, which was her grandfather, who died. So my granddaughter looked up at me with her father's soft, worried eyes and asked me if I was dying. I held that child's face in my 2 hands and I said, "No, baby, no. I am not sick. I am right here, and I am going to be right here. And you are going to eat my cobbler when you are a grown woman with babies of your own." And she believed me, the way children believe the people who love them. And she ran off to play, and I stayed kneeling on the floor of my own restaurant for a moment longer than I needed to, because I did not trust my legs yet. That was the moment. I want to be precise with you, because these stories turn on a single moment, and I want you to have mine exactly. It was not the sign. It was not the bare wall. It was not even the box with my name on it. It was a 6-year-old asking me if I was dying because the woman raising her had found it convenient to suggest that the grandmother was a thing that had been removed. In that moment, kneeling on my own floor, something that had been bending in me for 2 years quietly stopped bending and set, like concrete, into something that would not bend again. But I did not show it. I want you to understand that, because everything that follows depends on it. I have learned over a long life that the loudest thing in a room is almost never the strongest thing in a room. The strongest thing is usually the quietest. The strongest thing is the woman who has already decided and is simply waiting for the right hour and lets everyone around her keep mistaking her stillness for surrender. So I drove home with my husband's photograph on the seat beside me, and I hung it on the wall of my own front room. And I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat in Otis's chair by the window, and I let myself feel the whole weight of it, alone, where no one could see, the way I have done my grieving my whole life. And then I dried my face, and I went to the high shelf in the hall closet, and I took down the strongbox, and I took out the brass-cornered burgundy folder, the one Otis bought me at a stationer's the year we signed our first lease, the leather worn soft now and the brass gone dull, with the little gold-stamped label on the front that I had updated over the years until it read, simply, "Lease and License." And I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I learned the tax code by lamplight 40 years ago. And I opened that folder, and I began, quietly, to read. A week later, Renata called a family dinner. She called it at her house, the big house she and Marcus had bought on the strength of the restaurant's new numbers. And she called it for all of us. And I understood from the formality of the invitation that it was not really a dinner. It was an announcement. She was a woman who liked to do her important things in front of an audience the way some people do, the way my own story would end, with me doing one important thing in front of an audience too, though neither of us knew that yet. I came. Of course I came. I wore my navy blazer and my emerald blouse, because a woman should be dressed correctly when she's about to be insulted. It makes the insult land on better ground. My daughter Renee had driven in from out of state for it, because Renata had made it sound, on the phone, like something not to be missed. And Renee sat beside me at that long table with her nurse's watchfulness, reading the room the way she reads a patient. The dinner was the dinner those evenings always are. Renata had it catered by someone who was not us, which I noted and said nothing about. There was wine, and there was a great deal of talk about the future, the brand, the next location, the investors, words and words and words. And Marcus sat at the head of his own table looking like a man at his own trial, not quite meeting anyone's eyes, his big tired hands folded by his plate. And then, when the plates were cleared, Renata stood up. She had a glass in her hand, and she said she wanted to make it official in front of the family, because the family deserved to hear it first. She said that as of that month, the operating company had completed its restructuring, and that going forward, she would be taking full leadership of Mayfield's Kitchen and its expansion. She said the word leadership the way some people say the word crown. And she lifted her glass toward Marcus, who lifted his halfway and set it down again, and toward the investors who were not there. And she said, "To the table. The restaurant is in good hands now. Strong hands. Hands that are looking forward instead of backward." And then she looked at me. She looked at me down the length of that table. And I will give her this. She did not flinch from it. She had decided to say the thing, and she said it. With a small laugh meant to take the edge off, and instead putting the edge on. She said, "And Della, you know we love you. But I am not going to sit here and pretend the old arrangement was working. You are carrying overhead that the business cannot afford anymore. Honestly, and I say this with love, you have been dead weight on the margins for a while now. It is nothing personal. It is just numbers. And the new Mayfields cannot afford to keep paying for the old one's nostalgia. Dead weight on the margins." The table went silent. My daughter Renee went very still beside me, and I felt her hand come to rest on my knee under the table, ready to rise, ready to fight for me, because that is the kind of daughter she is. And I put my own hand over hers, gently, and I pressed once, which, in the language the two of us have spoken her whole life, means, "Be still. I have this. Watch." Because here is what I knew. Sitting at that table being called dead weight by the woman who had boxed up my life. I knew that the operating company Renata had just announced she led so triumphantly did not own the building it stood in. It rented it. From me. On a lease that came up for renewal in 11 weeks. I knew that the Mayfield name and recipes she was so eager to expand were licensed from a master franchise license that came up for renewal in the same season, held by one person, me. I knew that the city health permit that legally allowed her catered dreams to serve a single plate of food on those premises was issued to one name, mine, and renewed every 2 years by one signature, mine, and that it too came due that very season, because 40 years ago I had filed all 3 on the same week of the same year, and they had renewed in lockstep ever since. The dead weight on the margins was holding, in her own name, on a worn brass-cornered folder on the high shelf of her hall closet, the building, the brand, and the legal right to exist of the entire enterprise that had just declared her obsolete. I did not say any of that. I want you to sit with the fact that I did not say any of that, because it is the hardest and most important thing I did in this whole story, harder than what I did at the end. I sat at that table, and I let my daughter-in-law call me dead weight in front of my son and my grandchildren and a daughter who loved me. And I smiled a small smile, and I said the only thing I said all night. I said, "Well, I have always trusted the numbers, Renata. Let us see what the numbers say." And I picked up my water and I drank it. and the dinner moved on, and Renata thought she had won. And across the table I caught my son's eye for one moment. My soft, torn, ashamed son. And he looked away. And I felt my heart break for him, even then. Even as I was deciding what I was going to have to do to him. For him. I went home that night, and I did not sleep. But it was not a grieving sleeplessness, the kind I had known the first year after Otis. It was a working sleeplessness, the old kind. The kind I had known at this same table over the tax code and the contracts and the franchise negotiation. I made a pot of coffee at 11 at night like a younger woman. And I sat down with the brass-cornered folder, and I spread it all out under the lamp, the way you spread out the pieces of a thing you intend to understand completely before you touch it. The lease, the franchise license, the health permit, 40 years of receipts, and on every single one of them, one name. Della Mayfield. Not Marcus, not Renata, not the operating company, me. The next morning I called a lawyer. Not the family lawyer, not Renata's lawyer, not anyone who had ever sat at a table with my children. I called a young woman named Adeyezi, who had a small, sharp practice across town, and who had been recommended to me years ago by my own daughter, a lawyer I had used once for a small matter and had never forgotten, because she had read a 6-page document in front of me in 2 minutes, and then told me what was missing from it. She was younger than Renata, brilliant, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who does not raise her voice because she has never once needed to. I made an appointment, and I put the folder in my bag, and I went to see her. I sat across the desk from Adeyezi, and I told her the whole of it, plainly, the way I am telling you. And I laid the documents out on her desk, one by one, and I watched her read them. She read the lease. She read the master franchise license. She read the health permit. She read for a long time, and her face did not change, because a good lawyer's face does not change. But when she was done, she set her pen down very deliberately, and she looked at me, and she said, "Mrs. Mayfield, do you understand what you are holding?" And I said, "I think I do. But I would like you to tell me, in your words. Because I have learned that what I think I am holding and what I am actually holding are not always the same thing, and I want to be standing on rock before I take a single step." And she told me plainly, the way I had asked her to, and I am going to give it to you the way she gave it to me, because it is the spine of the whole story, and I want you to feel it land and the way it landed on me. She said, "You are not a problem at this restaurant. You are the foundation of it. Let me say it as simply as I can. The operating company that your daughter-in-law just announced she leads does not own the building. It is a tenant. You are the landlord. The lease comes up for renewal in 11 weeks, and on that date, the landlord, which is you, decides whether there is a lease at all. The company does not own the Mayfield name or the recipes. It licenses them from you, from the master franchise license, which you hold alone, and which also renews in this same season, and which only you can renew, transfer, or revoke. And here is the one that matters most," she said, leaning forward. "The health permit. The city permit that legally allows any food to be sold on those premises is in your name. It renews this season. If you do not renew it, then on the day it lapses, that restaurant cannot legally serve a single plate of food to anyone, for any price. Not because you are angry, because the law says a kitchen serves food under a permit, and the permit is yours." She sat back, and she said the thing that I have carried ever since, the thing that turned a wound into a choice. She said, "Mrs. Mayfield, your daughter-in-law has built her entire announcement, her leadership, her expansion, her investors, on a structure that rests, in 3 separate and independent ways, entirely on your signature. Without you, there is no building. Without you, there is no brand, Without you, there is not even a legal kitchen. She has spent 2 years quietly removing you from a thing that does not exist for one single day longer than you allow it to. The only question, and it is the only one, is what you want to do with that. If you have made it this far into Della's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. I sat in Adaise's office for a long moment after she finished, and I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because you might expect triumph, and there was none. What I felt, sitting there holding 40 years on a worn folder in my lap, was something closer to grief. Because the size of the power I held was also the size of the betrayal, exactly, to the penny. The more total my hold on that restaurant, the more total my family's failure to see it, to ask, to wonder for even one moment whose name the whole thing stood on before they boxed me into a garage. I had been so completely invisible to them that they had built their entire future on top of me, without once noticing they were standing on a person. And then, Adaises asked me the question that is the real question in all of these stories. The one underneath the legal one. She said gently, "Mrs. Mayfield, you could do a great many things with this. You could refuse the renewal and let the whole thing collapse, and that would be a kind of justice, and a cold one. You could renew everything and say nothing and keep being boxed up, and that would be a kind of grace, and a foolish one. You could call a meeting and tell them what you hold and let them sweat, and that would be a kind of power, and a small one. So before we draft a single document, I need to ask you the only thing that matters. Not what is legal, not what is owed. What do you actually want?" And I sat with that question the way I have learned to sit with hard things, slowly. And I gave her the only honest answer I had, which is that I did not yet know. I knew I would not let it stand. I knew I was done being dead weight in my own kitchen. But what I wanted, the shape of the thing, I did not have yet. And I told her so. And I told her I would not draw up a single paper until I did, because I had spent 40 years not signing what I had not fully read, and I was not about to start signing my own life in a hurry now. So I went home, and I did the thing that nobody expected, the thing that I think confused Renata more than any outburst could have. I went on with my life. I kept my counsel and I kept my routine, and I let the renewal calendar do its slow, patient work while I decided what I wanted. I kept going to church. Every Sunday, navy blazer, emerald blouse, fourth pew on the left, and I prayed. And I will tell you that the praying was different now, because I was no longer praying to be at peace with being invisible. I was praying to be shown the right way to become visible without becoming cruel, which is a harder prayer and a longer one. Sister Lorna asked me one Sunday how things were at the restaurant, because the whole neighborhood had seen the new sign and was grieving the old one. And I said, "Things are changing, Lorna, and the Lord and I are working out what to do about it." And she patted my hand and said, "Della Mayfield, in 40 years, I have never once seen you lose a thing you decided to keep." And I held on to that because it was true, and because she did not know how true she was about to be. I gathered my evidence the way I had gathered it my whole life, quietly, in order, without fanfare. I went down to the city offices myself, an old woman in sensible shoes, and I requested certified copies of the health permit history, every renewal for 40 years, all in my name. And the clerk made the copies and never once imagined she was handling the hinge of anything. I called the franchise company's records office and confirmed, as the master license holder, the exact renewal date and terms. And the young man on the phone called me ma'am, and had no idea he was speaking to the foundation the whole company stood on. I went through 40 years of receipts, the receipts I had kept because I keep everything, boxes of them, and I sorted them and I had a D's certify which ones established what. The chain of payments that proved, beyond any argument, that the building, the brand, and the license had been mine and only mine the entire time. I put all of it into the brass-cornered folder, organized, tabbed, complete, the way you load a thing you intend to fire only once. And while I did this, quietly, Renata launched her new Mayfields into the world. There was an opening night. A reopening, she called it. A grand reveal of the modernized brand, with the investors finally present, and the press she had cultivated, and a crowd of young people from the telephone screens, and twinkling lights strung across my husband's booths. She invited me. I want you to know that she invited me, and I want you to understand the particular cruelty of the invitation. Because it was not an apology. It was a performance of generosity, a chance for her to be seen, including the dear old founder. I almost did not go. My daughter Renee on the phone said, "Mama, you do not have to walk into that." And I said, "No, baby, I am going. I want to see it with my own eyes. I want to know exactly what I am dealing with before I deal with it. A woman who is about to act should first stand in the room and look honestly at the things she is acting upon." So I went to the reopening in my navy and my emerald, and I stood at the edge of the bright, loud crowd in the restaurant I built. And I watched my daughter-in-law hold court under my husband's painted-over sign. And at one point in the evening, she gathered the press and the investors near the kitchen pass, and she gave a little speech about the new direction. And she said a thing that I think she did not even know was the cruelest thing she said in this whole story. Because to her it was just marketing. She held up one of the new menu cards, the fancy ones, and she said with a laugh, "We have kept a few of the old recipes, of course, for the nostalgia crowd. But honestly, between us, the original stuff is heavy and dated, and we are elevating it for a modern palate. Grandma's cooking is sweet," she said. "But Grandma's cooking does not scale. Grandma's cooking does not scale." She was standing 6 feet from the spot where my Otis had stood for 40 years, making the food that was the only reason a single person in that loud, bright room had ever heard the name on the door. And she called his life's work heavy and dated. And the investors chuckled, and the young people nodded. And I stood at the edge of my own restaurant, and I felt the last of my hesitation burn away. Not into rage. I want to keep being honest with you about the rage. Because the easy version of this story is the rage version, and the rage version is a lie. What burned away was the last of my doubt about whether I had the right. A woman who will stand in your husband's kitchen and call his cooking dated to sell more of it does not love the thing she has taken. She only wants it. And a thing that is only wanted and not loved is a thing that has to be given back to someone who knows the difference. I left the reopening early, quietly, the way I do everything. And on the way out, I paused by the bare wall behind the counter where Otis used to hang. And a young woman, one of the new staff who did not know me, asked if I needed help finding the exit. And I said, "No, thank you. I know my way. I have known my way around this room for 40 years. And she looked at me, puzzled. An old woman in a navy blazer who knew her way around. And I smiled at her. Because it was not her fault that the world had decided to look right through me, and I went home. The darkest part came in the weeks after, and I want to tell you about it honestly. Because these stories skip the dark part, and the dark part is where the real choosing happens. In the weeks after the reopening, I had everything I needed. The folder was complete. Adais had the documents drafted and ready, 3 of them, that would let me do whatever I chose on renewal day. And I sat with that folder, night after night, at my kitchen table. And I found that having the power did not make the choice easy. It made it harder. Because I kept seeing two faces. I kept seeing Renata's face, the annoyance under the smile, the grandma's cooking does not scale, and that face made it easy. But then I kept seeing Marcus's face. My son, my soft, torn, ashamed son, who had looked away from me at that dinner table because he could not bear what was being done in his name and did not have the spine to stop it. And I knew that whatever I did to Renata, I did to Marcus, because they were tied together, and that the cleanest, most satisfying version of justice, the version where I let the whole thing collapse and Renata is ruined, was also the version where my son is ruined alongside her and my grandchildren's home and their future. The cold justice and the love were knotted together so tightly that I could not pull them apart with my hands, and for 2 weeks I could not see a way to be both right and merciful. And I will tell you that I wept at that table more than once. Not for myself, but for the impossible arithmetic of it. The books that would not balance no matter how I worked them. And then, late one night, near the end of those 2 weeks, I went again to the high shelf, and this time I took down something else. I took down Otis's composition book, the original, the one I had copied into the clean binder, the one in his own hand. And I sat with my husband's handwriting in my lap, his recipes, his margin notes, the little drawings he made of how a plate should look, and near the back, on a page I had read 100 times, never truly heard until that night. He had written a note to himself years ago about the business. It said, in his careful hand, "Remember why? Not the money. The table. Keep a seat at the table for the ones who forget they are family." And I sat there in the lamplight with that line, and I understood, finally, what I wanted. I did not want to win. I did not want to ruin. I wanted to take back what was mine, completely and without apology. And then I wanted to do the one thing that would prove, in front of everyone, that I was made of something my daughter-in-law was not. I wanted to keep a seat at the table for the one who had forgotten he was family. I wanted to give my son back to himself. So I called Adais in the morning, and I told her what I wanted. And she was quiet for a moment in that careful lawyer way. And then she said, "Mrs. Mayfield, I have done this work for a long time, and I have watched people who held what you hold use it to burn the whole house down. What you are describing is harder than burning it down. Are you sure?" And I said, "Adese, I have never in my life been more sure of anything. The burning is easy. Anybody can burn. I am going to do the hard thing. I am going to tell you exactly how it was arranged. Because I think the arranging is the part of these stories that people rush past. And it is the part I am most proud of, because there was no trick in it. There was no ambush. Everything I did was open and legal and quiet, and that is what gave it its weight. A reckoning that depends on a trick is a small thing. A reckoning that depends only on the plain truth, read aloud at the right hour, is a large one. The renewal of the lease required by its own terms a meeting between the landlord and the tenant, in person, with the building's documents present, to execute the new term. That meeting was already on the calendar for renewal day, because the operating company, Renata's company, had requested it months earlier, assuming it was a formality, assuming the landlord would simply sign whatever was put in front of her. They did not know who the landlord was. The paperwork went to the operating company's address, and Renata, I would later learn, had not even read it closely, because to her it was overhead. It was the boring part. It was exactly the kind of thing she had decided the dead weight used to handle, and that no longer mattered. She had scheduled her own reckoning and forgotten to read the invitation. And the franchise license renewal, by its terms, required a representative of the franchise board to be present to witness the master license holder execute the renewal, because a master license is a serious thing and the company does not let it renew by mail. So the franchise board, too, would have a representative there on renewal day, at the restaurant, at the appointed hour. So I did not have to arrange an ambush. I only had to be the one person in that room who had read what everyone else had ignored. I told Adaze to confirm my attendance at the lease meeting as the landlord. I told her to confirm my attendance at the franchise renewal as the master license holder. I asked her to be present herself, not to speak, just to be there. Because a thing like this should have a witness who understands exactly what is happening as it happens. And I asked her to prepare the documents I had decided on, 3 of them, and to put them in order in the brass-cornered folder. And I will tell you what they were when we get to the moment, because they are the whole point, and I want you to receive them the way the room received them. The night before renewal day, I did not sleep, and again, it was the good kind of not sleeping. I sat at my kitchen table with the brass-cornered folder closed in front of me and Otis's photograph on the wall behind me, and I did the thing I do before any hard thing. I talked to my husband. I know that some of you understand this, and some of you think it is the foolishness of a lonely old woman, and I do not mind either way. I said, "Otis, tomorrow I am going to take back our kitchen, and I am going to do it the way you would want, not the way she did it to me. I am going to keep the seat. I hope you would be proud." And the house was quiet, and the radiator ticked, and I felt the way I always feel when I talk to him. Not an answer exactly, but a steadiness, a hand on my back, the same steadiness that made an old landlord uncross his arms 40 years ago. And I went to bed, and I slept, finally, like a woman who has stopped carrying a thing alone. Renewal day was a Tuesday. I rose early, and I dressed with care because a woman should be dressed correctly for the most important morning of her life. The navy blazer, the emerald blouse, the pearls, my mother's gold chain, Otis's wedding band, which I have never taken off. And I did one thing I had not done in a long while, which is that I tied on my apron, my own apron, the worn one Renata had boxed into the garage, the one I had quietly retrieved from that garage the week before, because I intended, before that day was over, to be standing behind my own counter in my own apron. And I wanted to begin the day already dressed for the end of it. I picked up the brass-cornered burgundy folder. I held it to my chest the way I have held it to my chest 1,000 times, the leather soft and warm from 40 years of my hands and Otis's before me. The little gold label, lease and license, catching the morning light. And I drove myself to the restaurant, alone, because I had no intention of arriving on anyone's arm or leaving when anyone else was ready. The meeting was set for 10 in the morning, before the lunch service, when the restaurant would be open but quiet. The staff prepping, a few early regulars at the counter. I had timed it that way on purpose, with Adiza's help, not to make a spectacle, but because a thing like this should happen in the daylight, in the working restaurant, in front of the people whose lives the place actually touches, and not behind a closed office door where it could be denied and rewritten later. The truth, I have learned, needs witnesses, not a crowd. Witnesses. There is a difference. I parked the 11-year-old car that Renata was ashamed of, and I sat in it for a moment with my hand on the folder on the seat beside me, and I felt the old fear come up one last time, the fear that has been my companion my whole life. The voice that says, "Della, Sit down. Smile. Sign what they put in front of you. Do not make a scene. It is not ladylike. It is not Christian. Let it go. And I put my hand flat on the worn leather of the folder, and I said, out loud, in the empty car, letting a wrong stand is not the same as forgiving it. I can do both. Forgive her in my heart and undo it with my hand. Those are not the same thing, and I have spent my whole life confusing them, and I am done. And I got out of the car, and I walked toward the door of my own restaurant under my husband's painted-over sign, with the folder against my chest, an old woman in a navy blazer that nobody in that bright new place thought could change a single thing. I want to slow down now, because the next half hour is the half hour I have lived 1,000 times in my mind since, and I want to give it to you exactly as it was, without dressing it up, because the truth of it is better than anything I could add. When I walked in, the restaurant was just as I expected, open and quiet before the lunch rush, a few regulars at the counter, the new young staff in their new dark aprons moving around the prep. And there, near the front, was a small gathering that did not belong to an ordinary morning. There was Renata, in a sharp tan blazer, with a set of keys in her hand and a clipboard, looking impatient, clearly believing she was about to dispatch a piece of tedious paperwork. There was Marcus, standing a little behind her, in a gray button-down with his sleeves rolled, his big tired hands hanging at his sides, looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else. There was an older gentleman in a sport coat with a worn leather portfolio under his arm, who I knew at once must be the landlord's representative. The company that had bought Sal Pruitt's old building decades ago, here to renew the lease. And there was a crisp, younger man in a suit, with a sealed binder embossed with the franchise company's seal, here to witness the master license renewal. And there, to the side, having arrived just before me, was Adais in a charcoal suit, quiet, with her own slim case, watching everything. Renata saw me come in, and she did a small thing with her face, the annoyance. And then she arranged it. And she came toward me with the keys still in her hand. And she said, in a low voice meant only for me, but pitched with that edge she could never quite hide, "Della, what are you doing here? This is a business meeting. You really do not need to be here for this. It is just lease paperwork. It is boring. Why do not you go sit down, and I will have someone bring you a coffee?" And I looked at my daughter-in-law, holding the keys to a building she did not own, telling the landlord to go sit down and have a coffee. And I felt the strangest thing, which was tenderness. Because she had no idea. She truly had no idea. She was so certain of her ground that she could not even imagine there was no ground under her. And there is something almost childlike in a certainty that complete. And I have raised children, and I know that the most certain ones are sometimes the ones about to fall the hardest. I said gently, "I am here for the meeting, Renata." And she said with a little laugh, "The meeting is for the company, Della." "You are not," she paused, looking for the kind word, "you are not really involved in the operation side anymore, remember?" And the older gentleman with the portfolio, the landlord's man, looked up at that, because he had a piece of paper in his hand with a name on it. And he looked at me, and he looked at his paper, and a small puzzlement crossed his face. And he said, into the little silence, "Excuse me, but are you Della Mayfield?" And I said, "I am." And the gentleman from the landlord's company looked down at his paper and then back at me, and he said, with the careful courtesy of a man who has just realized the room is not arranged the way he was told it was, "Then, ma'am, I believe this meeting is for you. We are here to renew the lease on this building, and our records show the tenant of record, the leaseholder, is you, Della Mayfield. We can only execute the renewal with the leaseholder. With you. The restaurant went quiet, not all at once, but in a spreading way. The way a room goes quiet when something is happening that the people in it do not yet understand but can feel. Renata laughed again, but it was a thinner laugh now, and she said, "No, I think there is a mix-up. The lease is held by the operating company. I run the operating company. You can deal with me." And she held up her clipboard, as if a clipboard were a deed. And the gentleman from the landlord's company, polite, immovable, said, "I am sorry, ma'am. But that is not what our records show. The operating company is a subtenant. Or rather, the company occupies the premises under a lease held personally by Della Mayfield. The renewal must be executed by the named leaseholder. By her." I watched Renata's face begin to change. It was not the full breaking yet. It was the first crack, the moment a person who has built their certainty on a wall they never thought to check feels the first tremor in the wall. She turned to Marcus, fast, and she said, "Lo." "Marcus, what is he talking about?" And Marcus, my son, my soft-torn son, looked at his mother and looked at his wife. And I watched a thing happen in his face that I had been waiting 4 years to see. I watched him begin to understand. Because Marcus had grown up in this restaurant. Marcus had stood on a milk crate at the register, and somewhere in the back of my son's mind, a memory was surfacing, a memory of his father saying, "Della keeps the books, and your mother's name is on everything that matters." And I watched my son realize, in real time, in front of everyone, that he had let his wife box up and throw away and paint over and declare dead weight the one person whose name the entire enterprise had always only rested upon. And then the young man from the franchise board cleared his throat and made it worse for her and better for me, and said, "Perhaps this is a good moment to also confirm, for the master license renewal, that I am here to witness the execution by the master license holder of record, which our files also list as," he glanced down, "Della Mayfield. The same individual. Ma'am, are you also the holder of the founder's master franchise license?" And I said, "I am." I will not pretend that there was not a part of me standing there that wanted to savor it. I am a human woman, and I had been called dead weight and a thing in a garage and a nostalgia the business could not afford. And there is a hunger in the human heart, even a faithful one, even an old one, to be proven right in front of the people who wronged you. And I felt that hunger, and I am not ashamed of it. But I had decided, weeks before, at my kitchen table, with Otis's note in my lap, that I would not feed it. The whole reckoning, the real one, the one that would matter, depended on my not feeding it. So I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I did not turn to Renata and say a single sharp word, though every word was right there and I had earned every one of them. I simply walked, slowly, the way Otis taught me, to the long front counter, the counter where my husband had stood for 40 years, the counter where my son had learned to make change on a milk crate. And I set the brass-cornered burgundy folder down on it, and I opened the dull brass clasp, and the whole room turned to watch an old woman in a navy blazer open a worn leather folder, and not one person breathed. I took out the first document. I put on my reading glasses, the ones that hang on a chain, and I lifted the certified copy of the lease, 40 years old at its root and renewed 13 times. And I held it so the landlord's man could see it. And I said, in the clear, level voice I used to use on the men who did not know what color my hand was when I signed their loan papers, "This is the lease on the building at Pratt and Vine. It was signed in the spring of the year I turned 27 by Della Mayfield, sole tenant. It has been renewed by Della Mayfield, sole tenant, every term since. There is no other name on it. There has never been any other name on it. And I turned, not unkindly, to Renata, and I said, "The operating company you lead occupies this building as my tenant, at my sufferance, on my lease. You have a key to a building you rent from me. You have a key to a building you rent from me." Renata's hand, the one holding the keys, opened slightly, and the keys hung from her fingers, and I watched her look down at them. The keys she had changed the locks with, the keys she had used to box me into a garage, and I watched her understand that they were not the keys of an owner. They were the keys of a tenant whose landlord was the woman she had thrown away. A key is only power if the door is yours. Her key, in that moment, became what it had always actually been, a piece of brass that opened a door belonging to someone else. I set the lease down, and I took out the second document, and I held up the master franchise license. And I said, "To the young man from the board, this is the founder's master license. Every Mayfield's kitchen in 3 states operates under a regional license that hangs from this one. This one is the root. It was structured in the 1990s by me to be held by one person, renewable and revocable by one person, and that person is Della Mayfield. The brand my daughter-in-law announced she would expand is licensed at its root from me. There is no Mayfield's kitchen anywhere that does not, in the end, rest on this single sheet of paper with my single name on it." And then I took out the third document, the one Adazi had said was the quietest and the most total, and I held it up, and I said, "And this is the city health permit. It allows food to be served on these premises. It is issued to Della Mayfield, owner of record. It is renewed by me. It comes due this week. Without my signature on its renewal, by the end of this week, not one plate of food may legally be served in this building to anyone, for any price. Not because I am angry, because that is how the law works, and the law put my name on it 40 years ago and no one ever thought to change it." I set the 3 documents side by side on the counter, the lease, the license, the permit, and I laid my hand flat on top of them, my hand with Otis's ring on it, and I let the room hold what it was holding. The landlord's man cleared his throat gently and said, "Mom, then, are you prepared to discuss the renewal of the lease? Because I will be honest with you. The way the company instructed me to discuss it assumed a routine renewal with the operating company. But if you are the leaseholder, and you are, then the terms are yours to set." And Renata finally broke. Not into tears, not yet. Into panic, which is what comes before the tears in a person built like her. She stepped forward and she said, fast, her voice climbing, "Della, wait. Let us talk about this privately. You do not want to do anything rash. Think about Marcus. Think about the children. Think about everything we have built." And I heard the word "we," and I let it sit in the air, the "we." From the woman who had told $400 worth of catered guests that she was taking full leadership, that I was dead weight, that grandma's cooking does not scale, suddenly remembering, now that the ground was gone, that there had ever been a "we." I looked at her. And here is the moment, friends, the one I came all this way to tell you about. Here is the difference between a humiliation and a reckoning, and they are not the same thing. And I needed you to be here for the difference. I could have ended her. I want you to understand the full size of what I held, the way I understood it standing at that counter. I could have refused the lease renewal and put the operating company out of the building in 90 days. I could have revoked the master license and collapsed not just this restaurant, but every Mayfield's in 3 states that hung from it. And with them, every dollar of the investors Renata had promised so much. I could have simply declined to renew the health permit and let her bright, modern restaurant be unable to legally serve a single plate by Friday. I held 3 separate ways to destroy completely the woman who had called me dead weight. And I held them in front of her, and in front of my son, and in front of the staff and the regulars and the landlord and the board, in front of everyone whose opinion she had ever cared about. And she knew it. I watched her know it. I watched my daughter-in-law understand that the old woman she had boxed into a garage was holding her entire life in one steady hand. And then I did not destroy her. I turned to the landlord's man, and I said, in the level voice, "I am prepared to renew the lease." And I turned to the board's young man, and I said, "I am prepared to renew the master license." And I picked up the pen that Adaze had set on the counter, a good pen, and I signed the lease renewal, Della Mayfield, in the flowing hand my mother taught me. And I signed the license renewal under it. And I signed the health permit renewal under that. 3 signatures, slow and clear. The same 3 signatures that had held this place up for 40 years, renewed by the same hand for 1 more term. I signed the building and the brand and the right to exist back into my own keeping, openly, in the daylight, in the working restaurant, in front of witnesses, where it could never be denied or rewritten. And only when the ink was dry, only when the thing was done and mine again beyond any argument, did I turn to my daughter-in-law, and I said the thing I had decided, weeks before, at my kitchen table, that I would say. I said, "Renata, the restaurant is mine. It was always mine. You did not take it, because it was never yours to take. You only forgot to look at whose name held it up. As of this morning, the operating company's lease on this building is renewed on my terms, and my first term is this. I am the founder again, in name as well as in fact, the way I have been all along on paper." The sign goes back up. My husband's photograph goes back on that wall. The old recipes, the heavy dated ones that built every dollar this place has ever made, go back on the menu, exactly as he wrote them. And I am going to be standing behind this counter, in my own apron, tomorrow morning, the way I have stood behind it for 40 years. Renata's face finally came apart. The way a face does when the story it has told itself for years is corrected in a single morning in front of everyone. And she opened her mouth, and nothing came out. And I held up one hand, gently, not to silence her cruelly, but the way you gentle a frightened animal. And I said, "I am not finished." And then I did the thing that was the whole point, the thing Otis wrote in the back of his book, the thing my reckoning was actually for. I turned to my son. Marcus was looking at me, and his big tired face was wet, my son who had not cried in front of me since he was a boy. And he started to say something, started to say, "Mama, I am so sorry I did not." And I stopped him, gently, because there would be time for the sorry later at my kitchen table, the way real sorries come in pieces over years. And this was not the place for it. I said, "Marcus, I am going to need help running this kitchen. I am 67 years old, and I cannot do it alone, and I do not want to. Your father taught you this place before you could see over the counter. You know it in your hands the way he did. So I am offering you a seat, not the head of the operating company. That arrangement is over, and we will untangle it cleanly. I am offering you a seat at the counter beside me, learning the books the way I learned them, the way your father wanted for you before either of us was ready. The seat is for you. It is not for the company. And it is not, I said, and I did not look at Renata when I said it, because I did not need to. It is not for anyone who looks at 40 years of a family's life and sees only the margins. It is for the one who knows that this counter is not overhead. It is the table. Come back to the table, son. And my son came around that counter, past his wife, and he put his arms around me the way his father used to. And he held on, and I held my boy. And the restaurant, the regulars, the staff, even the landlord's man and the board's young man, looked away to give us the moment, because some things are not for an audience, even when they happen in front of one. I did not say anything more to Renata. I want you to notice that, because it is the whole shape of the thing. I did not turn and crow. I did not list her cruelties back to her. I did not need to ruin a woman who had just watched herself be ruined by the plain truth, read aloud in the daylight. She stood there for a moment, holding her useless key in a restaurant that had never for 1 second belonged to her. And then she gathered herself, the way her kind always can. And she walked out alone, and the door swung shut behind her, and nobody chased her, and nobody jeered. And that was exactly right. The villain in a true reckoning is not paraded. She is simply, quietly, displaced from the place she was never standing as solidly as she thought. That is the reckoning. But I have learned that the part that comes after the reckoning is the part that tells you what the reckoning was actually for. And I have a little more to tell you. And I would be grateful if you would stay with me to the end of it. Because the end is the part that matters most. The sign went back up within the week. I had Otis's original board restored, the gold letters on the green, Mayfield's kitchen, where you eat like family. And the morning they hung it back over the door, the old regulars stood on the sidewalk and some of them clapped, these old men who had eaten at my counter for 30 years. And one of them, Mr. Caldwell, who is 91 and has come in alone every day since his wife passed, took off his hat the way Otis used to, and he did not say anything. He just put his hand over his heart. And I had to go in the back for a minute. Otis's photograph went back on the wall behind the counter, in the clean, pale rectangle that had been waiting for it. And it fit exactly, of course, because the ghost of a thing is always exactly the size of the thing. And my husband looked out over his dining room again, smiling in his apron, where he belongs, where he will stay as long as I am breathing and longer, because I have already arranged it, the way I arrange everything, on paper, in my own name. The recipes went back. The heavy, dated, does not scale recipes that my Otis learned at his grandmother's elbow and that I copied out in my own hand, every one of them. Back on the menu exactly as he wrote them. And the young people from the telephone screens kept coming, more of them than ever, because it turns out that the thing that does not scale is the very thing they were hungry for. The thing you cannot fake or modernize or elevate. The thing that is just a person who loves you cooking you something real. Grandma's cooking does not scale. No, it does not. That is the whole point of it. It was never meant to scale. It was meant to feed the people in front of you like family, and you cannot do that to 1,000 people at once. You can only do it to the ones at your counter, and so we feed the ones at our counter. And that is enough, and it has always been enough, and it will be enough long after the kind of people who say does not scale have moved on to the next thing they intend to take. I want to tell you what happened to Marcus, because I know you want to know, and because the answer is the whole point of why I did it the way I did it. Marcus took the seat. He came back around that counter, and he has not left it. We untangled the operating company cleanly, with Adaizi's help, over a few careful months. And it was not without pain, because his name and Renata's were braided together in it the way names get braided in a marriage. And pulling them apart cost him. But he did it. And the strangest and most beautiful thing happened, which is the thing I had hoped for and prayed for, and could not have made happen by force. My son found his backbone. Not because I gave it to him, You cannot give a grown man a backbone any more than you can give a child one. He found it because he was finally standing in a place that was solid enough to grow one on. He had spent his whole life being pulled in half between people, agreeing rather than being right, tearing himself apart to keep everyone happy. And it turns out a man cannot grow a spine on shifting ground. He needed ground that did not move. The counter did not move. His father's recipes did not move. His mother's steady hand did not move. And on that ground, slowly, my soft, torn boy grew, at last, into a man who can say a hard, true thing and stand behind it. He learns the books now, at my kitchen table, the same table, by the same lamp, the way I learned them 45 years ago. And some nights he gets frustrated because the numbers swim sideways for him the way they did for his father. And I tell him what I used to tell Otis, that the numbers do not have to love you, they only have to be read. And we read them together, slowly, and he is getting better. He will never love the books the way I do, but he no longer hands them to someone else and looks away. And that is the whole of what I needed. I want to tell you what happened to Renata too, because these stories usually end with the villain destroyed. And I told you at the start that this one would not. And I want to keep my word to you. Renata and Marcus separated, and then, after a long, hard year, they divorced. I will not pretend I am sorry, and I will not pretend I am glad, because the truth is more complicated than either. And you are old enough, all of you, to hold a complicated truth. A marriage where one person needs to control everything and the other has no ground to stand on is a marriage that was always going to come to grief, with or without a restaurant. And the restaurant only showed them, sooner and more clearly, what was already true. I did not ruin Renata. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to my own soul. I took back what was mine in front of her, and I declined to destroy her when I could have. And she walked out of that restaurant with her career intact, her name unsmeared, her reputation in the city untouched by a single word from me, free to go and build something of her own somewhere, honestly, from the ground up, the way Otis and I built ours. What she lost was not her future. What she lost was the things she took, and a thing you took was never yours to lose. She lost a borrowed kingdom. I gave her back to her own life. Whether she makes something good of it is between her and God. And I pray for her still, on Sunday in the fourth pew, because a woman that hungry for control is a woman who has never once felt safe. And I meant that the first time I said it, and I mean it now. And you cannot pray for someone for years and then stop praying for them just because they wronged you, or your prayers were never worth much to begin with. I want to tell you about my grandchildren, because they are the reason the mercy mattered. The day after I took the restaurant back, my granddaughter, the 6-year-old who had asked me if I was dying, came into the restaurant with her father, and she saw her grandfather's photograph back on the wall, and she saw me behind the counter in my apron, and she ran to me, and she said, "Grandma, you came back to life." And I knelt down and I held that child, and I said, "I never went anywhere, baby. Some people just could not see me for a while. But I was here the whole time." And she has eaten my cobbler every Sunday since. And she is learning, slowly, to make the cornbread standing on a milk crate at the counter the way her father did, the way I hope her own children will someday. And the line of it goes on. The table goes on, which is the only kind of scaling that was ever real. The kind that goes down through the generations, one loved child at a time. My daughter Renee, the nurse, who sat beside me at that terrible dinner and pressed my knee ready to fight and trusted me when I pressed her hand back and said, "Be still," has not stopped telling the story, 2 states away, to anyone who will listen, about her mother who walked into a restaurant being called dead weight and walked out the founder again without raising her voice once. She makes it sound grander than it was. I tell her to stop. She does not stop. A daughter who is proud of her mother is a thing you do not really want to stop, when you are honest about it. Mr. Caldwell still comes in alone every day, 91 years old, and sits at the counter, and I make sure his coffee is hot before he asks. And some days, we do not say more than 10 words to each other the whole hour, and that is its own kind of love. The kind that just shows up, every day, regardless. And Terence, the cook Renata let go, the one Otis taught, I called him the week I took the place back. And I offered him his kitchen, and he came back, and he runs that kitchen now out of Otis's book in his own good hands. And the food is right again, all the way right, the way it had not been since my husband died. And the first day Terence cooked the oxtails the old way, the right way, I stood at the pass and I closed my eyes, and I could smell my husband in the room. A few months after it was all done, Marcus and I were sitting at my kitchen table one evening, after the books were closed, and he asked me the question I had been waiting for him to find the courage to ask. He said, "Mama, why did you not just tell us?" Years ago. Why did you let it get all the way to that morning, with the landlord and the board standing there? Why did you let Renata box you up and call you dead weight and put you in the garage, when one sentence, one time, at any dinner, would have stopped the whole thing? You could have just said, "The lease is in my name." Why did you let it go so far? And I told him the truth, the same truth I am telling you. And I did not soften it. Because I have learned that softening the truth is how you starve the people you love. I said, "Because, baby, a thing that is said as hard as this had set does not break with a sentence at a dinner table. If I had said it early, said it small, said it across a plate of food, Renata would have heard it as a threat from an old woman trying to hold on to her power. And you would have been torn in half between us the way you always were. And nothing would have changed except that it would have gotten uglier and quieter and gone on for years. The truth had to be said all the way, in the light, in front of witnesses, with the documents on the counter, or it could not be heard at all. Some things break with a quiet word. This one had to break with a hammer in the daylight, in front of people, or it would not have broken. It would only have bent and sprung back harder. I am sorry it had to hurt you to watch. I am not sorry it broke. And I want you to learn the lesson under the lesson, son, the one your father wrote in the back of his book, and that it took me 40 years to learn. Being unseen is not the same as being small. I let myself be unseen for so long that I started to believe the two were the same thing. And you grew up believing it too. That the quiet one, the one keeping the books in the back, the one who does not need the room to look at her, must be the least important one. She is usually the most. Do not ever again mistake a person's quietness for their smallness. The quiet ones are very often the ones holding the whole thing up. And he was quiet a long time, my son, and then he said, low, in his father's voice, "I see you now, Mama." And I told him that was all I had ever wanted. And it was true. I still have the folder. The brass-cornered burgundy folder that Otis bought me at a stationer's the year we signed our first lease. The leather worn soft now, and the brass gone dull. The little gold label that reads, Lease and License. It sits on the high shelf in my hall closet, in the strongbox, with the renewed lease and the renewed license and the renewed permit inside it. All in my name, all good for another long term, and Otis's original composition book beside it. And I take it down sometimes, in the evenings, and I hold it. And it still smells faintly of the leather shop where my husband bought it 40 years ago. And I think about the whole long road of it. I think about Sal Pruitt with his arms crossed in the doorway, and Otis taking off his hat and saying, "Give us a year." I think about my name going on that first lease, not as a plan, but as a trust, because my husband knew which of us read the contracts. I think about all the nights at this table over the tax code and the receipts and the franchise lawyers who told me I was leaving money on the table. I think about the morning Otis died and the promise I made him in the gray light. And I think about my own name, my one quiet name, that I carried like a small, unimportant thing through 40 years of being looked through, the name that turned out to be the foundation, and the whole house stood on the entire time. I have thought a great deal, since that morning, about why I almost did not fight, about why a woman could hold, on a worn folder on a high shelf, the complete and total power over a thing, and let herself be boxed into a garage rather than use it. And I have come to understand that it was not weakness, and it was not even only love, though it was partly both. It was a lesson I had carried too far. I was raised, the way many of us were raised, to be humble, to not put myself forward, to let my worth be discovered rather than announced. And that lesson is a good one, and a true one, and I would teach it to my granddaughter tomorrow. But every good lesson has an edge where it turns into its own opposite, and I had walked past that edge years ago without noticing. And my humility had curdled, somewhere in there, into a kind of hiding, and my not needing the credit had become a way of letting the people I loved grow up believing the account was empty. And a mother who lets her children believe the account is empty when it is full, when she is the one who filled it, is not being humble. She is teaching them, by her silence, to despise the very thing that built their whole life. I did that, not on purpose, but I did it, and I had to undo it. And the only way left to undo it, after all those years, was to read the account out loud, once, in the daylight, where they could not pretend they had not heard. So that is what the folder is, in the end. It is not a weapon. I want you to hear that, because the world will tell you a story like mine is about a weapon, about an old woman who had a card up her sleeve and finally played it. That is not what it is. The folder is a ledger. It is the written down record of 40 years of a woman's quiet worth, kept faithfully, in her own name, through every season she was overlooked. And a ledger is not meant to be a weapon. A ledger is meant to be read. You keep it quietly all your life, you give and you build and you ask for nothing, and you let your worth be discovered the way the good lesson says. But you do not let them tell you the account is empty. And when the day comes that someone stands in your husband's kitchen and calls your whole life dead weight, you take the ledger down off the high shelf and you carry it into the light, and you read it out loud, calmly once, all the way to the end. And then you put it back on the shelf and you tie on your apron and you go back to work. Because the reading was never the point. The work was always the point. The table was always the point. The reading is just what you have to do sometimes. So they will let you keep the table. There is one more thing, and then I will let you go, because it is the thing I most want to leave you with. A few weeks ago, on a Sunday evening, after the service and after the cobbler, my granddaughter, the one who asked me if I was dying, who is 7 now and serious in the way that some children are born serious, was sitting at my kitchen table while her father closed the books. And she was watching me the way that child watches everything, taking it in, saying little. And when it was time to go, she hung back and she said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" And I said, "Always." And she said, "Mom says you almost lost the restaurant. But you didn't, because your name was on the secret papers. Is that true? And I said, it is true, baby. Except they were not secret. They were just papers nobody bothered to read. And she thought about that, the way she thinks about everything. And then she asked the question that made me go to the closet. She said, but why didn't you tell everybody your name was on them before it got so bad? Why did you let them think you weren't important? And I looked at that serious child, and I got up, and I went to the high shelf, and I took down the brass-cornered burgundy folder, and I came back, and I set it on the table in front of her, and I opened it, and I showed her the lease with my name on it, and the license with my name on it, and 40 years of receipts. And I told her what I am telling you. I said, sit down, baby, and let your grandmother teach you the most important thing she knows, the thing it took her 67 years to learn all the way. There is a kind of strength that does not need anyone to see it. That is a real strength, and it is a good one, and I want you to have it. You do the work, and you keep your name on what is yours, and you do not go around announcing yourself. Because the people who have to announce themselves are usually the ones with the least to announce. But baby, listen to me. There is a difference between being humble and being a coward, and it is the easiest difference in the world to lose. And your grandmother lost it for almost a whole life. Being humble is keeping the ledger quietly. Being a coward is letting people you love believe the ledger is empty because you are too proud, or too tired, or too afraid to ever let it be read. You keep your ledger quiet, child. Give and build and ask for nothing, the way your great-grandfather did, the way I have tried to. But the day someone tells you your account is empty, when you know that you are the one who filled it, you take it down off the shelf, and you carry it into the light. And you read it out loud, calmly once. You do not scream it. You read it. And then you go back to work. Do you understand me? And she looked at the folder, and she looked at me, and she nodded. My serious girl. And I believe she did understand. More of it than a 7-year-old should. And I am going to give her that folder someday, when she is grown and ready, the way my grandmother gave me her ledger, and I think the account will be in good hands. So that is my story. That is what it cost to be treated as dead weight in the place I built with my own 2 hands. And that is what it was worth on the morning the lights came back up and everyone in the room finally remembered my name. It is evening now. Where I am, as I tell you this. The supper rush is over, and Marcus has gone home, and the last regular has gone home, and the light coming through the front windows of Mayfield's kitchen has gone gold and is going gray, the way it does, and Otis's sign is back up over the door, and his photograph is back on the wall behind the counter where he can watch the room. And the brass-cornered folder is home on its high shelf with all of it renewed and safe in my name. And I am sitting in a wooden booth, my own booth, in my own restaurant, in my navy blazer and my emerald blouse and my husband's ring. An old woman who is no longer dead weight in anybody's accounting, least of all her own. And I am at peace. If this story touched your heart, if you felt it land somewhere old and tender in you, then I think you may be one of the people I made it for. And I want to ask you something. And I want you to sit with it slowly, the way I have learned to sit with things. Have you ever been counted out by your own family, treated as a burden in the very place you built, made to feel that your whole life amounted to nothing in someone else's accounting? And if you have, when the moment finally came, did you choose to be right, or did you choose to be merciful? There is no wrong answer. I have done both in my long life, and I can tell you only that one of them lets you sleep at night, and one of them does not. And you already know which is which. And if this story meant something to you, Do an old woman a kindness and let me know you were here. Give it a like, so the others who need it can find it, and subscribe to her quiet reckoning, so you do not miss the next one. Because there is always a next one. There is always another woman the world counted out who turns out to have been holding the pen or the lease or the license all along. And before you go, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because I like to imagine all of you out there, in your kitchens and your cars and your quiet rooms, the seen and the unseen, the thanked and the overlooked, all of us keeping each other company for a little while. Leave your name. Leave your city. Let me know you were here. I read them, the way I read those 40 years of receipts, one at a time, slowly. And I think of each of you as a name in a ledger that is finally, after all these years, being read out loud. Wherever you are tonight, and whatever they have decided you are worth, I want you to hear an old woman who fed this whole neighborhood for 40 years tell you the one thing it took her a lifetime and a brass-cornered folder to finally believe. Your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. It never was. It never will be. Keep your ledger. Give quietly and build something real, and ask for nothing. And let your worth be discovered the way the good women before you taught you. But do not let them tell you the account is empty, and do not go to your grave with it unread, because a full ledger, kept too long in the dark in the name of your own humility, will break your heart. There is a day to take it down off the shelf. When that day comes, do not scream, and do not gloat, and do not burn the house down. Just stand up and walk into the light and read it out loud, all the way to the end. And then tie on your apron and go back to your table and feed the people in front of you like family, because that, in the end, is the only thing that was ever yours to keep. Good night, and God keep you, and thank you for sitting with me a while.